and I will give the call to the Honourable Bill Leadbetter and remind members that, as is usual, to extend the usual courtesies, as this is the member's inaugural speech.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Leadbetter.
Mr. President, who of us has not awakened on a warm spring morning to hear the siren song of the cicada? For years, it gestates, it grows, and it matures deep underground. And then finally, it emerges, and for 6 weeks, it sings to the skies, and then it's gone. I joined the Labor Party 19 years ago, and I've done what active party members do. I've been active in branches, I've convened policy bodies, I've run as a candidate in state and at federal level. My political self has gestated, it has grown, it has matured. And here I am today, a legislative councillor, and I am here to sing, at least in metaphor. I will not trouble my parliamentary colleagues with my often inaccurate tenor baritone, but I will speak my words with the zeal of a 19-year locust. This is my first speech in this chamber. It is also formally my last speech in this chamber. It is a hail and a farewell, in Latin, a language with which I'm familiar, awe atque vale. Or as one of my friends, who is, I think, present here, called it, my inaugurdictory. But such is my time in this parliament. It's a mere shadow, a breath that goes out and is gone. I begin, though, with an acknowledgement. We stand in this house, in this city, on land that was once entrusted to the charge of the Whadjuk Noongar people. I acknowledge the survivors and the descendants of that great nation as the traditional owners of this land, and I pay my respects to their elders, those who have passed by, those who are with us, and those who are yet to come. As with all of us, Mr. President, there is a deep substratum of people who have assisted us in becoming who we are and what we bring to this place. We all stand on the shoulders of others. Rather like that famous woodcut by Abraham Boss that serves as the frontispiece of the original edition of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. We are all people composed of many other people. Those who have raised us, taught us, encouraged us, laughed and mourned with us, struggled with us, triumphed with us. I've had, by a great many measures, a fortunate life. I grew up in Sydney, the son of Ruby, who was a teacher, and Arch, who was a policeman, and then a social worker. Both of my parents worked to meet the needs of others, to create possibilities for them, to keep them safe. After he left the police, my father became a social worker where he worked amongst some of the most disadvantaged and marginalised members of our community. Again, working to give hope, possibility and security. Our house was a house full of books, full of music, full of vigorous conversations. My parents believed in the value of education, sacrificed much to give me the best education that they could. And I was always expected to go to university, and in this I did not disappoint them. I might have in my chosen course of study. They hoped that I would do law, but I chose history. And if they were disappointed in that, they didn't show it for very long. I was fortunate too to have been born at a time when universities were free. That meant not just that I could go, but that there were a whole lot of people at Macquarie University, my alma mater, who otherwise might not have been there. Universities were beginning a process, unfortunately largely reversed over the past 2 decades, of opening themselves up to working people, to midlife women, to retirees, all of whom went seeking an education rather than job training. I was a beneficiary of this, as was my wife, who was enabled to go to UWA and to study medicine, as was her sister, and her 2 brothers were also able to go to university. The Norman family, the family of my wife, the 4 children of a policeman who was later an AMBO, were all given that possibility once denied to their parents and to former generations. And how those people have enriched our community. I share my parents' faith in education as a means of personal, social and intellectual improvement. That is one of the key reasons that I'm in the Labor Party. It is the party of education, the party that opened up universities to people beyond elite private schools and selective state schools, the party that consistently seeks equity in education through establishing transparency and driving reform in funding models. It is to be regretted that the Abbott government trashed the original Gonski funding package pretty much the first chance it had, and that the Turnbull government only recently has announced that it is developing a new version that still serves, while talking equity and fairness, to cut overall funding for education. And in this context, it is always the poorest who suffer most. The Barnett government prided itself on being a reform government in education through the introduction of independent public schools. But education reform consists of a great deal more than rebadging schools and devolving to them the management of funds. Actual education reform puts the needs of students first. And that includes a commitment to those most in need of individual attention. Actual education reform ensures that teachers are well prepared for their profession, well supported with resources and assistance, and well respected by students, parents, and the broader community. I was fortunate to have had a mother who was an exceptional teacher, with an abiding love for literature, for Shakespeare, for Jane Austen, for Andrew Marvell, for Gerard Manley Hopkins. And I had wonderful teachers too at primary school and secondary school and at tertiary level. They opened my eyes to the wonders of the world and the glory of the humanities. Above all, they taught me to learn and became the models for my own life as a teacher. It has been my privilege, as some members may know, to spend a lot of time in ancient Rome. I was led there by Richard Rowling and Margaret Beattie and Ted Nixon and Edwin Judge. With such excellent guides, I met some truly fascinating people who remain my intellectual friends to this day. When I was contemplating running for office a couple of years ago, I consulted the Roman expert on this, Cicero. In his study of the Roman state, called imaginatively On the Commonwealth, or more romantically in Latin, De Republica, he makes a familiar observation. No one likes a politician. So colleagues, take comfort that even in the years of the Roman Republic 2,100 years ago, politics had a bad reputation. And Cicero asked the question, Why would a sensible person involve themselves in politics? Why would anyone put themselves through that when integrity, honesty, motivation are consistently questioned and impugned? And Cicero's answer was simple. Someone has to do it. And it's better than it is somebody of integrity and honesty and good motives. We can't help what people say about us. We can only be true to ourselves. Now, someone who is a deep believer in the value of a tertiary education, whether trade training or education in a profession, I have a hope, I cling on to this hope, a dream that young people in Perth's eastern suburbs might aspire to attend a university in their own backyard. In the recent state election campaign, and indeed the campaign before that, the Liberals in Midland sought to make much of the establishment of Curtin University's medical school in the site of the former Midland Railway workshops. Look, it was said and stated and trumpeted in the press, we have brought a university to Midland. Only if a rind is a cheese or a peel is a fruit. That was a shadow and a shell of a university and will continue to be until real investment is made. We need and continue to need a real tertiary institution for Midland, centrally located in the eastern suburbs, to which all young people can aspire, which offers hope to all those who wish to retrain, requalify, or simply to grow through learning and not have to commute long distances to do it. But there's not much point in the foundation of such institutions if students are priced out of their aspirations. One reason that my parents could aspire for me to go to university in a full fee environment was that Menzies Liberals supported universities through a generous Commonwealth scholarship scheme. Now, no such scheme exists, just more fees and more debt. Here in WA, the previous state government increased TAFE fees by 510%. That is, they more than quintupled what students were expected to pay for their professional training. And unfortunately, given the parlous state of the budget with which we were left, it'll be a long time before those fees can be reduced sufficiently to make TAFE education as affordable as it should be for young people. In the same way, the Commonwealth's new round of university funding cuts will not only price people, the poorest people, out of the market, it will also price out of the market people who otherwise could have attended, people who are quite important, who gain from universities in a special way, mature age people, many women. I don't accept that universities can afford these cuts because of the cost of course delivery has fallen below income generated. For the most part, those costs have fallen because universities have increasingly casualised their academic workforce, which has led both to a hollowing out of the academic profession in Australia and a migration of many academics to better supported tertiary systems in the US, Canada and Britain. For many years, universities were punished for being prodigal. Now they are punished for being frugal. Now, my parents did not just give me a belief in the inherent value of education. When I was a teenager, about to start my first job, my mother said something that always stayed with me. Always join the union, my son. It was the union that fought for your wages and your conditions, and it is only the union that will watch out for you. And this, I remind my parliamentary colleagues, was from a Menzies Liberal. Always join the union. And so I always have. When I was a university student, I was an active member of my students' union and indeed was heavily involved in reforming what was then the Australian Union of Students. When I edited the student newspaper at Macquarie, a newspaper called Arena, I joined what was then the Printers and Kindred Industries Union, the PKIU. When I became a teacher, I joined the Australian Education Union. When I became an academic, I joined the National Tertiary Education Union, a union of which I'm still a proud member. And I'm grateful for the work of all those unions and all of those like them. I'm offended by the trash talking and demonisation of unions by Conservatives in our community. I do not accept any proposition that employers create jobs to benefit the people whom they employ. They create jobs in order to derive a profit from their business. That's not criticism, it's observation. The point of a business is to generate a profit, and that's done by maximising income and minimising cost. It is unions who protect workers from the dangers which are inherent in that, who stand up for safety on work sites. And they should be applauded for that, rather than castigated by a Conservative commentariat as obstacles to economic growth or fined for doing their job. Not so long ago, we witnessed in this country a deliberate judicial attack on the union movement through the Hayden Royal Commission. Now, there were genuine issues to be addressed, and they were addressed. And there were real rotters and thieves to be identified, and they were identified. About 40 of them from the entire union movement across the entire nation. About 40 people were referred to relevant authorities, and to this point there's been one conviction. And still the Conservatives, the defenders of bank robbers and tax evaders, continue to pillory the union movement for being self-serving and corrupt. And in this respect, a few unions have come in for some pretty heavy treatment. No union, for example, has been more criticised than the CFMEU. We regularly heard, especially during the debate on the reinstitution of the Australian Building and Construction Commission, that the CFMEU were a bunch of thugs and bullies who needed to be brought into line. Yet it is the CFMEU that is there when people die or are seriously injured in the workplace. When people die on building sites, and they do, it is CFMEU members who bear the brunt of those terrible tragedies, as witnesses, first responders, and as campaigners for justice. I don't condemn the CFMEU for being robust in seeking to protect their members, because they're not just safeguarding their livelihoods, but their very lives. In the same way, we're often told what a bunch of uncompromising militants the MUA is. Well, of course they are. They have to be. The Howard government tried to wipe them out. Remember that? I well remember that national assault on a trade union. It happened not long after I came to Perth in 1998. And I remember just how militant the Commonwealth government was in seeking to crush the union. I remember the dogs and the riot police and the constant attempts to provoke violence. But I also know that the MUA stands for something more than good wages and conditions. It stands up. And it stands up for Australian jobs, for Australian workers. This is a talk that Prime Minister Turnbull talks, most recently in his pea and thimble trick with 457 visas. Yet his government persists in the deregulation of the maritime industry, which encourages the growth of flag of convenience shipping and the export of Australian maritime jobs. At a time when security is tightening internationally in the transport sector, the Commonwealth is lifting security requirements. At a time when we need a trained and proficient merchant marine, the Commonwealth is exporting those jobs to the Philippines. Who is really doing the job? of standing up for the country here? Is it the Commonwealth, whose members are sworn to do so? Or the MUA, whose members are more frequently just sworn at? I applaud the MUA and I understand its militancy. This is not a sector in which moderation will serve, since it has not been offered either by employers or by their political allies. Mr. President, it's not so long since the appalling employment rorts in the 7-Eleven franchise were laid bare by the media. For this, we have to thank the tireless efforts of members of United Voice and the SDA. We have here a demonstrated case where, across a franchised operation, employers have systematically exploited their workers, underpaying them, in effect stealing their labour. United Voice and the SDA are to be commended, not condemned, for standing up for those workers and for other workers like them who are still vulnerable and subject to abuse. These are not historic cases. I'm not delving into the depths of history here. These are examples from a contemporary Australia, from recent memory. These are the stories that tell me that the dark satanic mills of William Blake's poem, The Age of the Workhouse and the Sweatshop, of piecework and day labour, could so easily return without the steady vigilance of the sentinels of the union movement. My mother was right. Always join the union. I am proud to be a unionist, just as I am proud to be Labor. As I've said, Mum and Dad were both Menzies Liberals, but not so partisan that they would not have set that aside for me. They've both been gone for 25 years, but I feel them with me every day, and I feel too their swelling pride in this moment. I came to Western Australia 19 years ago to teach history at Edith Cowan University. My education in Western Australian politics began almost immediately. Harry Phillips was my office neighbour, and I learned much from snatched or long conversations with him, with basically either me standing in his doorway, cup of coffee in hand, or him standing in my doorway, cup of coffee in hand. And I also came to know a former member of this place, Bob Hetherington, now sadly departed. It was Bob who first brought me up to Parliament for lunch. It was Bob who first brought me into this chamber to walk through surreptitiously. I did not think 19 years ago, when I first entered this room, this chamber, that I would return to it in a different capacity. Not long after I arrived in Western Australia, I joined the Labor Party. I joined to make friends and to settle into my Western Australian life. My inquiries were welcomed by one of the then Assistant State Secretaries, Bill Johnston, well known to members of this place. I'm honoured to say here with us now, and Minister for Mines and Petroleum, Commerce and Industrial Relations, Electoral Affairs and Asian Engagement. I'm glad he's found the time to pop in. Bill sent me to a meeting of the Perth sub-branch to have my membership approved. And the president of that sub-branch was Greg Roberts. Greg Roberts has been my firm friend and supporter in matters both personal and political ever since. It was Greg who initiated me into the ways of the Labor Party and encouraged my entry into politics every step of the way. Together, Greg and I have walked on Roman bridges in France, fished unsuccessfully off Ocean Beach in Denmark, pruned fruit trees, driven the hills of Perth, and, I have to say, eaten countless lunches. It was Greg who stood by my side when I married my wife, Margot. It was Greg who managed me with great diligence and probably some frustration during the long campaign for the seat of Hasluck. It is Greg who still keeps me going. And if this honourable member seems to be sailing serenely along, it is because Greg is somewhere in the background making it all happen. Greg, of course, is not a solo act. He is, for Michelle, the model of the loyal and supportive and ever-present political spouse. And along with Greg, I came to know the Honourable Michelle Roberts. I've had 2 phone calls that have been life-altering, and in a good way, both from Michelle. The first was in 2007, inviting me to join her ministerial office as speechwriter and principal policy officer for Heritage. It was in that office that I really learned ways to transform political ideals and ideas into the daily reality of helping people and seeking consistently to make their lives better. In this, I could hope for no better role model, mentor and friend than the Honourable Michelle Roberts. I have now worked for and beside her for 10 years. Michelle is a person of deep belief, unwavering principle, profound personal loyalty. She is also immensely generous. I remember celebrating a certain birthday with a 0 in it when I worked in her ministerial office. She marked the occasion by baking the most delicious and incredibly memorable lemon meringue tarts. I will never forget those pastries. They remain the best I have ever tasted. At my wedding, it was Michelle who arranged buttonholes for the groom, best man and groomsmen, and in a delightful surprise ensured that every table at the reception was decorated with flowers. The second phone call was in November 2015. I was on Rottnest, about to begin a weekend's retreat, and the phone went. And it was Michelle, suggesting that I put my name forward for pre-selection for Hasluck. And so a great adventure began that is not wholly over. Throughout that time, she has been stalwart in support, sagacious in counsel, and always ready to help, and I'm honoured to have her as my friend. I've made other friends too in that time. Margaret Quirk, MLA. Passionate, compassionate, smart, frank. You know how frank. And consistently underestimated. And also, I now discover, a great pal to share an office with. The Honourable Kate Doust, for whom I once briefly worked, and with whom I'm privileged to serve in this chamber. Likewise, the Honourable Sally Talbot, whose Denmark hospitality is, I think, proverbial. Elsewhere in the party and in the great cloud of witnesses who surround me, I would add in the federal sphere Matt Keogh and Tim Hammond, who have been consistent friends and supporters. Locally, Steve Wainwright, who ran my 2010 Pierce campaign. Jean Wainwright, who was a constant source of pragmatic wisdom. Julie Wainwright, who tried to staff every booth in Pierce. If you know the seat of Pierce, you know how hard that is. John Gangel, who is a tireless grassroots campaigner. Emmy Barzotto, my boss first, and then my friend, who has a very clear vision, very long memory. Elizabeth Roberts, my style consultant, and so many others. Mark and Jeff, who put their lives on hold for a little to work in my office. Luke, Frank and Angela, Sally Ann, Rachel, Jacob, Lisa, Amy and Damien, Michaela. The list is long and it grows longer the more I think about it. But when I came to Perth, WA Labor was not the only family that I found. I also became, after a time, a member of the Cathedral Congregation of St George. I am an Anglican, and I take my faith seriously. It has been the deepest part of me for most of my life, and it is one of the reasons that I stand here in this place and speak. Since I was 19, I have been impelled to work in all the ways that I have been able for justice in our community. The reason for this I find best expressed by Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his book Ethics, a book he was still writing when he was executed by the Nazis in the dying days of World War II. He wrote, "The hungry need bread and the homeless need a roof. The dispossessed need justice and the lonely need fellowship. The undisciplined need order and the slave needs freedom. To allow the hungry to remain hungry would be a blasphemy against God and one's neighbour. For what is nearest to God is precisely the need of one's neighbour." I have learned much from the Cathedral. Firstly, from both of the deans I have known, the Reverend Dr. John Shepherd, AM, and the Right Reverend Richard Pengelly, and from the many good friends that I have made there, and I have to say continue to make there. It was Peter Bedford, now a professor in the United States, who introduced me to the Cathedral community, and Catherine Arends, who suggested that I make it my home, and I shall always be grateful to them for that and for many other things. The final two people whom I wish to acknowledge this afternoon are those souls who make my life complete. My wife, Margot, and my daughter, Maya. Margot is a formidable person and is a constant source of wonder to me. I have to say, it is a constant source of wonder to me that she chose me to be her husband. Not only does she run a demanding obstetric practice that sometimes requires she leave the warmth of bed and home at 2 a.m. for a delivery, but she's also loyal, forthright, generous, and above all, kind. And kindness is a virtue that we are all too short of, especially in public life. When there's a craving for the instant critique, the knee-jerk cheap shot, the zinger of a put-down, that's not her nature. What is her nature is the patience and the kindness that she has shown in supporting her aberrant husband's political adventures, whether with wise counsel, financial support, or the simple and deeply faithful act, which members will appreciate, of staffing a polling booth all day. My daughter, Maya, is the most powerful reason I have for doing anything. Although we have lived in different cities since she was 5, she remains a vital part of my life. She is now on the cusp of adulthood. And I want to ensure in whatever ways that I can that the world in which she lives and moves is morally and materially better than the difficult and cluttered now that we currently experience. It is worth remembering, amid all of the words, that what we do in this place and what is done in every parliament has a genuine consequence for the material well-being of a great many people. It is worth remembering too that the opposing sides that we take in any debate here might, in other communities, in other lands, in other times, in other contexts, be the entrenched positions in a more violent conflict. I believe that the first gift that we can give to the future is to preserve and enhance parliamentary democracy. which is what we do instead of civil war, and what Westminster parliaments have done since the restoration of Charles II in 1660. I want the next generation to believe in this funny, wonky, quirky system as much as I do. And one challenge, I have to say, for the 40th Parliament will be the constitution of this chamber, since it remains gerrymandered in favour of rural constituencies. And I'm pleased to see that this is a matter that has already been raised by the Honourable Bill Johnson in his role as Minister for Electoral Affairs. Parliaments do good work, and governments do good work. But that is obscured by a hyperactive and a scandal-hungry media. The problem, for which there is no easy answer, is to build a degree of public trust in the integrity of our institutions. We cannot function as a community if we do not trust the things that are there for our benefit. The police, the legal profession, the justice system, schools, the teaching profession, hospitals, the nursing and medical professions. I want a future for my daughter in which those institutions are naturally trusted and in which corrupt behaviour is regarded as unusual and aberrant. And I want a future for my daughter in which she can be whomever she can be, marry whomever her heart beats for, embrace whatever religion she wishes, or none. Because no matter how powerful the nostalgia is for a past that never was, remains, amongst both the mainstream and marginal conservative movements. The multicultural boat sailed a long time ago and it's not turning round. I bless the fact of our multicultural community. I love its depth. I revel in its joy. One thing that I've been able to do in my short time is to attend a number of cultural festivals, and what a boon they are to our broader community. Multiculturalism is about so much more than a wider range of food in food halls. It is the depth to our shared culture, as each community, from our first Australians to our latest arrivals, adds their own history to our common experience and what we're often accustomed to think of as a young country turns out to be very ancient indeed. And for this to continue as well as it has, we need to be so much better than merely tolerant. Tolerance is ambiguous and insipid. We need to go higher, to acceptance and to celebration. And we need to remember something that our teachers tried to teach us in school. We need to remember to listen to one another. That is the wonderful thing about this place. It is a place for speaking, in French, parlement, and if for speaking, then for listening. In Parliament, we get our best work done in committee, when we're actually actively listening to one another. If we spend all of our time sitting in quarantine silos, shouting slogans at one another, then neither our political life nor our public institutions will prosper. Rather, they and we will fragment, and our community will become a society of competing truths, forever seeking to trump one another rather than learn from one another. The temptation to open our mouths and close our ears is deep and perennial, and has become more and more enticing as extremists have flourished and moderation is spurned. When my daughter Maya was 18 months old, the world in which we live changed suddenly and dramatically. The images of aeroplanes flying into the Twin Towers in New York remain with me, as they do with many people, I'm sure many of you in this chamber. It was an event that has changed our world profoundly. It has led to wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, to the emergence of Daesh, to the collapse of dictatorships in Libya and Syria, to the stifling of Turkish pluralism, to acts of random terror even here in Australia, to the tightening up of security in this chamber. Make no mistake, the enemy that we face, and we do face the enemy, is the enemy of moderation, is the enemy of secularism, is the enemy of pluralism, of multiculturalism, of human rights. It's the enemy not just of Christians and Jews and secularists, but of Muslims the world over. And the best form of resistance to such a foe is to be ourselves, to celebrate a society in which many cultures can form a single community and people of many faiths can pray together for peace. That is the world that I want for my daughter, for her friends, for her sister, for her generation. Mr. President, March the 11th marked a new stage in the life of our state. Labor's decisive victory heralds, dare I say it, a fresh approach to government in this state. One of the hallmarks of the previous government was that while it was prepared to put an enormous amount of resources and energy into legacy projects like Elizabeth Quay, the Perth Stadium, or the rolling disaster that is the Children's Hospital, it wasn't prepared to devote a similar amount of energy to actually running the state. One of the key issues that the McGowan government is delivering on, and doing so early, is to commence the long process of reforming the public sector, a sector which has been permitted by practices that I can only describe as malign neglect to balloon out of control. And I have to say that I'm really excited and impressed by the policy by which Perth Modern will be taken into the 21st century. I know that there are many who will feel nostalgic for wood panelling. I can see in this chamber reasons for doing so. But wood panelling and heritage are not the things in themselves that make a great school. Just ask the governors of Hale School, who moved it twice in its history. What makes a great school is not real estate, but community. And that's just as possible in a CBD high-rise as it is in an Edwardian grammar school. I commend the McGowan Labor government and its Education Minister, my parliamentary colleague, the Honourable Sue Ellery, for this far-sighted policy, and I look forward to the day when Perth Modern will actually be modern. Moreover, as someone who lives on the fringe of the urban fringe, right at the edge of the city at Bullsbrook, I'm also eagerly anticipating the day when I can park and ride into the city from Ellenbrook Railway Station. These are the projects which matter far more to people than a riverfront development with a toxic water park at its heart. I'm honoured that even for this brief and shining moment, I am a member of a government that will do these things. Mr. President, it only remains for me to wish you well. You have served this Parliament and this state honourably and diligently. You are an adornment to this Parliament, and your presence in this chamber is a steadying influence as governments have come and gone. You have been an outstanding servant of the people of Western Australia, and upon your retirement you shall be missed.
Thank you.
Mr. President, this council is as old as the colony of Western Australia. Great ones have sat here, and indeed still sit here. It has been my honour to have become one of that number. By next week, it shall all be gone. This moment, a treasured memory. Many of my parliamentary colleagues here will still be here and joined by others. Certainly this council will still be here carrying on the work that was begun in 1829. And so will the need to represent the people of Western Australia in this place. It is a weighty task, but I'm sure that the incoming members of the 40th Parliament will be up to it. I thank the House.
Yeah,